Halo Wars. Prologue. The UNSC Spirit of Fire dropped out of slipspace on the outskirts of the planet Harvest. Captain James Cutter stood on the bridge, gazing out through the viewscreen at the besieged human colony world. It was a lush, green planet, but Covenant warships clustered around it like vultures. Cutter could see the telltale plasma burns, where they had already begun glassing parts of the surface. "Bring us into high orbit and deploy longsword squadrons for air support," Cutter ordered. "Have all available Marine forces ready for immediate surface deployment. We need to push the Covenant back and buy time to evacuate those colonists." The seasoned captain had seen plenty of battles over the years, but this one filled him with dread. An entire Covenant armada was committed to sacking Harvest, and intel suggested they were unusually intent on excavating Forerunner ruins on the surface. Humanity was still no match for the Covenant's technological superiority. Still, while Cutter lived and breathed, he would fight to the last to protect the innocent souls on Harvest. "For the people of Harvest," he muttered under his breath. "Bring hell down upon these alien bastards." Chapter 1. Cutter's eyes narrowed as he studied the holographic display on the bridge, showing troop deployments around the primary population centers on Harvest. The Covenant had established beachheads near most of the major cities, while their Seraph fighters dueled with the UNSC's longswords in the skies overhead. "Lieutenant, deploy Rhino companies to reinforce the eastern quadrant," Cutter ordered. "If we allow the Covenant to overrun Axon, they'll have a straight shot at the orbital elevators." The young officer relayed the orders, maneuvering mechanized columns around the holographic map with swipes of his hands. The situation grew graver by the hour, but Cutter kept his steely focus. As a captain in the UNSC Navy, for over 30 years, he had learned to shut out distractions and make the best of impossible scenarios. Cutter opened a comm channel to the Marine forces on the ground. "Sergeant Major, what's your status?" "Covenant bastards are pressing us hard along the entire Axon defensive line," came the grizzled reply. "Those Jackal snipers have our men pinned down, and their Wraith mortars are tearing apart our barricades. We're giving them hell, but I don't know how long we can hold this position without reinforcements." "Rhinos are already en route," Cutter reassured him. "Keep your heads down and hold the line. Help is coming." He closed the channel and turned to watch a squadron of longswords streak past the bridge. The fighters unloaded missiles and cannon fire into a Covenant cruiser, tearing a ragged gash along its hull. But the remaining Covenant ships returned torrents of plasma, swatting 3 of the longswords from the sky. Cutter silently cursed. It was like trying to fight a raging wildfire with a trickle of water. But he had to do whatever it took to buy more time. Chapter 2. On the outskirts of Axon, Sergeant John Forge hunkered down behind the smoking hulk of an overturned Scorpion tank. Covenant Wraith mortars fell all around, bursting buildings into rubble and scattering civilians fleeing in terror. He sighted down his battle rifle and took out a pair of Jackal snipers perched on a rooftop. "Rhino 1-1, what's your ETA?" he barked into his radio. "We're getting murdered out here." 2 minutes out, hang tight, came the strained reply. "Be advised, locusts and banshees inbound on your position." Forge peered skyward and spotted the alien assault craft swooping in low. "A hell," he muttered. He turned to the squad hunkered down with him. "Get ready to light those bastards up." The Marines leveled their weapons as the banshees commenced their strafing runs. Forge tracked his sights over a banshee and fired controlled bursts, shredding its thin armor plating until it erupted in a purple fireball. The Marine beside him launched a rocket from her SPNKR, blowing a Locust gunship to pieces. The Banshees pulled up and out of range, but then the earth shook beneath Forge's boots. He turned to see Covenant armor rumbling towards them, a dozen Wraith tanks surrounded by squads of infantry led by gold-armored elites. Forge's blood turned to ice. "Fall back," he shouted. "Fall back to extraction point Beta and get those civilians loaded onto transports." They fled down ruined streets while Covenant plasma bolts sizzled past them. Forge radioed Cutter with an update. "Captain, be advised. Covenant have broken through defensive lines in Sector 17. Recommend immediate evacuation before we get encircled." "Acknowledged," Cutter replied. "Extraction teams are already inbound to your position." Forge and his Marines sprinted through clouds of dust and smoke, chased by Covenant hunters. They reached a highway bridge jammed with overturned civilian vehicles and terrified people. Forge directed the civilians onto a small convoy of waiting transport warthogs, while his Marines formed a protective perimeter. Then the Covenant were upon them. Hordes of grunts and jackals, supported by elites, stormed up the highway, plasma and needles filling the air. A civilian transport exploded as a fuel rod cannon scored a direct hit. "Hold this bridge," Forge shouted, leveling his rifle. The Marines poured fire into the Covenant charge. Forge saw dozens of aliens fall, but still they kept coming. Then Salvation roared overhead in the form of a D-77TC Pelican dropship. It turned broadside to the Covenant below, and its chin-mounted gun shredded grunts to pieces. "Sergeant Forge, your escort has arrived," came the voice of the pilot. "Let's get you people the hell out of here." "You're a sight for sore eyes," Forge replied. "We're loading the last civilians now." He turned to his Marines. "Extraction team has arrived. Let's move out." They piled into the remaining transports while the dropship laid down suppressive fire. Forge stood at the rear of a warthog, firing his rifle on full auto as they sped away from the bridge. He kept shooting until the Covenant were out of sight, swallowed by smoke. This had been a defeat, but at least they had saved some innocent lives. Forge only hoped Cutter could turn the tide of this doomed battle before it was too late. Chapter 3. Aboard the bridge of the Covenant cruiser Incorruptible, the Arbiter Reaper, Morami gazed down at the planet Harvest. The human vermin were putting up stiff resistance, but they were merely delaying the inevitable. The Holy Covenant would burn their worlds and yank their very civilization from existence. A major elite approached with a clenched fist to his chest. "Excellency, our forces have broken through the human defenses around the city of Axon. We await your order to commence bombardment." Reaper, Morami nodded. "Burn it to glass." He watched through the view screen as lances of plasma rained down from multiple cruisers, scouring the human structures from Harvest's surface until only bubbling green glass remained. Soon, this entire planet would meet the same fate. Another officer approached. "The humans fight fiercely for a race of infidels. To think they could pose any threat to the Covenant is preposterous." The Arbiter turned, his eyes flashing dangerously. "You underestimate them to your peril. I have faced their soldiers before, and found no lack of courage, but courage alone cannot stand against our might." An alert chime sounded from the sensor station. "New contact, Insurrectionist destroyer on intercept course with Strike Group Gamma. Ripa Morami studied the tactical display. A lone rebel ship emerging from hiding to engage a vulnerable detachment on the far side of the planet. Fools. Their paltry fleet posed no real threat, but their harassment had proven an irritating distraction during this otherwise straightforward campaign. No more. Detach 2 cruisers and a carrier to intercept, Morami ordered. Burn that ship from the sky, then glass the entire area. Let us purge this human pestilence once and for all. The slipspace rupture alarm blared moments later. A hatchway tore open in the starfield off the Incorruptible's port side, and a human battle group dropped into real space. Multiple UNSC contacts, shouted the sensor officer. I am tracking a heavy cruiser, several destroyers, and over 24 support craft. Ripa Morami studied the urgent combat updates with rising concern. The humans had gathered a considerable force for this counterattack. Their timing suggested they hoped to catch the fleet temporarily dispersed while moving to intercept the insurrectionist ship. Clever, if ultimately futile. Regroup Gamma and Delta strike groups to brace for enemy assault, Morami commanded. Move several cruisers out of bombardment positions around Harvester to reinforce. This would allow the human ships defending Harvester a brief respite, but that could not be helped. Ripa Morami ground his jaws together in frustration. The headstrong Covenant fleet commanders had left their blockade dangerously depleted in their rush to crush the rebels. Now they had gifted the humans an opportunity to relieve pressure on Harvester, if only temporarily. But the Arbiter remained confident that human lives saved today would eventually be burned away tomorrow. When the Covenant returned its gaze to Harvester, the planet's fate would be sealed. Chapter 4. Captain Cutter studied the evolving battlespace map and quietly allowed himself a grim smile. The Covenant fleet orbiting Harvester had been caught partially out of position by his task force's surprise arrival. He intended to make them pay dearly for that mistake. Helm, bring us into attack range of that carrier, but stay outside their main gun arcs. Have our ship board MAC guns target plasma turrets to weaken their defenses. The UNSC Spirit of Fire was a heavily armed Marathon-class cruiser, and her 3 powerful MIC cannons could tear through a Covenant ship's shields with sustained fire. Combined with the rest of his battle group, they now had a chance to bloody the Covenant's nose and gain some breathing room. UNSC All Under Heaven is moving to engage cruiser targets to starboard, his weapons officer reported. Torch-class ships are commencing anti-fighter screening operations. Through the viewscreen, Cutter watched the destroyers All Under Heaven and Redoubtable wheel gracefully into the fray, unleashing salvos of Archer missiles that burst against Covenant shields in dazzling flashes. The smaller Paris-class frigates screened them against Seraph fighters with torrents of 50mm rounds. In return, angry globs of plasma streaked towards the human ships. Cutter gripped his command table as the Spirit of Fire shuddered under plasma impacts. Shields holding at 83%, came the damage control report. We've got a few fires on the lower decks that are being contained. Cutter studied the fleet status displays. The Covenant had momentarily pulled back their capital ships, but they were regrouping into an ominous battle formation. Get me fleet comm. Fleet comm online, sir. This is Captain Cutter. Use long-range MIC fire and keep our distance, but be prepared to engage the enemy up close on my mark. The other UNSC captains signaled acknowledgement. Cutter watched as the center of progress drifted closer, unleashing plasma broadsides against the Redoubtable. "Helm, intercept course plotted," announced the navigation officer. "Targeting solutions locked in." Cutter nodded. "Fire MAC guns." The deck plating rumbled as all 3 MAC rounds launched in succession. The 600-ton slugs crossed the void in seconds and smashed squarely into the center of progress amidships. Its shield flashed and ruptured. "Their shields are down." "Mark target," Cutter commanded. "All ships, close and engage at optimal range. Hit them hard." The UNSC ships accelerated towards the stricken Covenant cruiser, circling like wolves moving in for the kill. The Redoubtable drew alongside, hammering the center of progress with punishing broadsides. Cutter watched grimly as their rounds blasted chunks of alien armor plating into space. Then the Covenant ship exploded in a brilliant white flash, leaving only scattered debris where a mile-long warship had once stood. The UNSC ships wheeled away, scattering to evade return fire from the Covenant fleet. Cutter allowed himself a fierce grin. "First blood to us today." This was just the opening skirmish, but giving the Covenant a bloody nose lifted human morale. And he had one more card to play. Before withdrawing, Cutter had dispatched several teams of ODST Special Forces troops on boarding missions against seemingly damaged Covenant ships. If just a few of those daring boarders managed to seize a bridge or plant bombs at critical areas, the UNSC might tip the odds further. For now, it was time to regroup and prepare for the Covenant's retaliation. Cutter knew they had merely bloodied the alien's nose. The real battle was still to come. Chapter 5. 2 hours later, Cutter was no longer smiling. The Covenant counterattack had hit his battle group with relentless fury. His ships were fighting valiantly, but the UNSC force had lost a third of their strength. The Covenant seemed intent on sacrificing numerous ships just to draw the human vessels into the mass of their fleet. They were slowly grinding Cutter's command down through attrition. "Damage report," he barked. "Our MAC gun is disabled, and Archer pods are at 15% capacity," came the grim reply. "Deck 6 suffered a hull breach, and we have over 80 confirmed casualties. Engineering teams are working to restore reactor output to 60%. On the tactical map, Cutter watched helplessly as the destroyer Gallant met its end. Dozens of Seraph fighters swarmed the stricken ship, tearing it apart until escaping atmosphere ignited and blew its spine in half. Cutter strengthened his resolve. The people of Harvest were counting on him. If his ships cut and run now, the planet would be doomed. But he had lost over a third of his ships, with more being pounded into wrecks by the minute. Duty required him to assess the situation with a cold, pragmatic eye, no matter how much it pained him. "Ensign, open a secure channel to Fleet Comm." "Channel open, sir." "This is Captain Cutter to all UNSC ships, acknowledge." He was met by static and the last few remaining voices of his battered task force commanders. Cutter steeled himself. "It is time to initiate Cole Protocol. All ships are ordered to plot randomized slipspace jumps immediately. Rendezvous at Point Zeta." There was no time for debate. The Cole Protocol dictated an immediate retreat if a human force risked utter destruction. Their only hope was to disperse temporarily and survive to battle another day. Around Cutter, the bridge crew exchanged grim nods. They worked quickly, hands flying across consoles to plot an emergency slit-space jump that would scattering their ionized weight and make tracking impossible. Course laid in, sir, on your mark. Cutter took one last look at Harvest on the view screen. He imagined the millions of colonists still huddling in fear below. I'm sorry, he thought. We gave them our best fight. Mark, he said quietly. The stars elongated as Spirit of Fire tore a hole into slip-space. Cutter felt the deck lurch as the ship navigated the chaotic extra-dimensional realm. When they finally transitioned back into normal space, Cutter gazed out upon an empty starfield millions of miles from Harvest. Only 7 other UNSC ships from his original 30 had managed to escape and rendezvous here. Cutter bowed his head for a moment before turning to his bridge crew with renewed purpose. We may have delayed the Covenant, but make no mistake, this battle is not over. Open a secure channel to our reinforcements at Reach. Harvest will not fall without a fight to the bitter end. Part 2. Erase for the Artifact. Chapter 6. Sergeant Forge slammed his fist against the Pelican's interior in frustration as he watched Harvest recede into the distance. We shouldn't have left, he growled. There are still civilians down there counting on us. Captain Cutter regarded him solemnly from across the troop bay. You know, I wish we could stay, but our fleet is in shambles. We can't help Harvest now, but there are billions more counting on us to stop the Covenant. He activated the central holodable and called up the images Forge, and his Marines had captured fleeing the planet. Strange Forerunner symbols and geometric designs glowed from ancient shrines and obelisks on Harvest. These symbols are our only lead to stop them, Cutter said. Our researchers have linked them to Forerunner sites across human space. I believe the Covenant are trying to triangulate something hidden on Harvest. Forge frowned. So while we were getting our asses shot off down there, ONI scientists were hunting for alien treasures. This goes beyond mere artifacts, Sergeant. Whatever the Covenant seeks could shift the course of the war itself. We have one final chance to deny them this prize. Cutter zoomed the display into a complex series of Forerunner glyphs. By cross-referencing marks you retrieved from the surface, our experts believe there is a major Forerunner installation hidden somewhere in Harvest's Arctic regions. I'm tasking the Spirit of Fire to lead a battle group there immediately to find and destroy it. Cutter nodded grimly. If what you've uncovered is accurate, we have no choice but to prevent the Covenant from claiming this installation at any cost. Ready all available Marine strike teams for immediate surface deployment, and get me Sergeant Forge on the comm. Moments later, Forge's grizzled features appeared on the display. Forge here. What's the situation, Captain? We have a new mission, Sergeant. ONI researchers believe they have uncovered clues pointing to a major Forerunner installation hidden somewhere in Harvest's Arctic regions. Forge's eyebrows shot up. Forerunner site? Right under our noses this whole time? It seems so, unfortunately. So does the Covenant now. I'm dispatching the Spirit of Fire with a battle group to find and destroy this facility before the Covenant can exploit it. Your Marines will lead the surface teams to locate the entrance. Forge grinned wolfishly. Just point us at the alien bastards. We'll blast our way through them and blow that place to hell. Cutter almost smiled at the man's grit. That's the spirit, Sergeant. This will likely be the most heavily guarded site on the planet. Expect fierce resistance. Don't worry, sir. My boys will get it done. Forge out. The comm clicked off. Cutter gazed out the bridge view screen at Harvest growing larger as they descended into high orbit. A massive Covenant fleet still encircled the planet. He silently prayed they could slip through undetected to buy enough time for Forge to work his magic planetside. There would be no retreat or mercy this time. Today, they took the battle directly to the Covenant's doorstep. "All hands, this is the captain speaking," he broadcast to the entire ship. "We have one final chance to halt the Covenant's plans in this star system. Every crew member has their part to play. Stand firm to your duties, and we will carry the day." He nodded resolutely as the ship prepared to drop back into the fire. Now it was time to finish this fight. Chapter 7. The Spirit of Fire emerged from slit space on the dark side of Harvest's largest moon, shielded from detection. Cutter studied the tactical display as dozens more UNSC ships arrived and took up attack positions. "Navigation, chart our approach vector to bring us in behind this gas giant," he ordered. "We'll use its magnetic fields to mask our signatures." "Aye, sir, plotting course now." While the battle group maneuvered into position, Cutter opened a comm channel. "Sergeant Forge, what's your status?" "My men are geared up and the transports are prepped for orbital drop," Forge replied from the loading bay. "Just give the word and we'll drop in quiet as ghosts." "You'll be landing in hot zones crawling with Covenant patrols," Cutter reminded him. "Locate that site fast and dig in. We'll need to buy time for the engineers to rig the demolition charges." Forge grinned. "Just make sure you save a few aliens for us down there. I owe them for Axon City." Despite himself, Cutter smiled. "Give them hell, Sergeant. We'll keep the Covenant fleet busy up here, Cutter out." He studied the map, looking for weak points in the Covenant blockade. Several gaps between the orbiting capital ships offered a slim chance to slip through and make it planetside. "All ships form up and follow our lead," Cutter commanded. "Use the magnetic wake of that heavy cruiser to mask our thruster signatures. We'll maneuver right through their picket lines." It was an insanely risky gamble. But staying here and waiting made little difference with a foe this numerically superior. Their only hope was the element of surprise. Cutter watched breathlessly as Harvest loomed closer on the main view screen. The Covenant ships flowed past in an endless ring, smooth purple hulls bristling with weapons. "Steady," Cutter murmured, hoping their wakes blended in amongst the hundreds of other ships. "Steady." A flashing red light appeared on the sensor display as they slipped through the fleet's midsection. "We've been pinged by an active scan from that carrier." Cutter's heart seized. "Emergency thrust. Get us clear helm evasive maneuvers." The Spirit of Fire's engines flared as the cruiser juked and jinked wildly, finally emerging from the opposite side of the blockade. Alarms wailed as plasma fire streaked after them. "Prepare for orbital descent," Cutter ordered. "Launch all broadswords and clear a path all ships, follow our vector down, and deploy ground teams." The UNSC ships scattered and dove towards Harvest through a hail of plasma bolts. Pelican dropships streamed from their bays, making a beeline for the planet below. On the Takmap, Cutter watched grimly as two frigates took direct hits from plasma torpedoes and exploded. But over 24 ships, including Spirit of Fire, managed to punch through under the cover of their strafing broadsword fighters. Now the surface teams just had to survive what awaited below. Chapter 8. Forge braced himself as the Pelican dropship hurtled through Harvester's atmosphere, its frame rattling violently from atmospheric entry. Outside, he glimpsed Covenant anti-air wraiths firing arcs of plasma up at them. His own broadsword escorts returned fire, clearing their way down. 1 minute to LZ, the pilot shouted over the din. Be ready for a hot drop. Forge glanced around the troop bay, where 24 other Marines waited, weapons ready. He felt the usual pre-combat jitters, but focused on mentally preparing himself. Lives depended on them completing this mission. The Pelican flared its engines and descended toward a snowy ridgeline. The rear door hissed open, and Forge leapt out into knee-deep powder, pulse rifle scanning for targets. Other Marines fanned out alongside him and rushed to establish a perimeter amidst the icy crags. Forge toggled his comm. Captain, the Wolfpack has landed. We are proceeding on mission. Acknowledged, came Cutter's reply. The Covenant have scrambled air units inbound to your position from multiple directions. Expect contact in minutes. Forge checked his mission clock. We'll be long gone by the time they arrive, Forge out. His HUD indicated the entrance to the Forerunner site lay 1.2 kilometers northwest. Forge took point and led his Marines onward through the frozen mountain pass. The wind howled with blowing snow, masking their approach. Suddenly, Forge spotted a purple-shade turret dug into a snow embankment up ahead. He raised a clenched fist, signaling the Marines to halt. Jenkins, take that gunner out on my mark, he whispered into his mic. The Marine slid up, sighting down his sniper scope. Copy, one hostile in my crosshairs. Forge listened intently, but only heard the wind. Take the shot. Jenkins' rifle cracked, and the grunt gunner collapsed over his turret. Forge waved his men forward before more guards arrived to check. They advanced up a narrow ravine littered with Forerunner obelisks and glyphs etched into the icy walls. Captain, we are on site, Forge radioed. I repeat, we have located the entrance. Excellent work, Sergeant, Cutter replied. Secure the area and await engineer teams for demo prep. Stop that Covenant prize from falling into enemy hands. Affirmative, sir. We'll get it done. Forge signed off and stared down the massive alien doorway sealed at the end of the ravine, like a giant vault. You want to keep the Kavis out? He muttered. Then we're going to bring this whole damn mountain down on top of it. He motioned his Marines to form a perimeter while they waited for engineers to arrive. Forge knelt down behind a rocky outcropping, squinting against the wind and blowing snow. His motion tracker suddenly flashed red with multiple contacts. He peered through his scope and spotted emerging from every direction elites, jackals, grunts. An entire Covenant expeditionary team already on site. Ambush, he roared. Defensive positions. The Marines hastily scattered as plasma bolts and needler rounds began tearing into their cover. Forge sighted down his rifle and took out a jackal, then an elite, but return fire was rapidly shredding his squad. Captain, the Covenant beat us here, he shouted into the radio. They were already inside the damn vault. We are taking heavy casualties out here. Hold them off as long as you can, Sergeant, Cutter replied. More strike teams are en route to reinforce your position. Forge cursed as more Marines fell around him. Negative, sir. We will never hold this ridge. I've got to collapse the entrance now before they unlock its secrets. He peered around the outcropping at the huge sealed doorway. Cover me, he yelled to his men. Then he broke from cover and sprinted toward the alien vault, rifle blazing on full auto. He triggered his armor's speed boost, barely outracing the plasma bolts at his back. Forge reached the massive doorway and frantically slapped demolition charges onto its alien alloy surface. "Fire in the hole," he yelled into his radio, then hit the detonator. A thundering explosion collapsed the ancient entrance in a billowing cloud of snow and ice. Forge was lifted off his feet by the icy blast wave. He crashed hard onto the rocks, then tumbled limply down the ravine's slope. Blood spread across the snow from a gash on his forehead. As darkness crept into his vision, Forge gazed up and saw the epic avalanche rumbling down, sealing the Covenant inside their prize vault forevermore. He managed a small grin before the blackness took him. Mission accomplished. Chapter 9. Forge awoke in the Spirit of Fire's infirmary to see Captain Cutter standing over him. "Welcome back, Sergeant. We feared you might not make it." Forge struggled to sit up. "The mission. Did I succeed?" Cutter smiled. "That you did. Your actions caused an avalanche that has buried the entrance beyond Covenant reach. What's inside will stay inside, thanks to you." Forge leaned back with relief. After a moment, his eyes narrowed. "But something is still wrong. You'd be celebrating if we were in the clear." Cutter's expression turned grim. "The Covenant have retaliated swiftly for what you did. They have committed over 70 ships to ring the planet. We cannot run or hide this time. They mean to slaughter us all." Forge clenched his fists. They both knew the UNSC fleet, still in orbit, stood no chance against that kind of force. "Well, if this is it, I'd rather go down fighting," Forge said. "What do you need from me?" Cutter gripped his shoulder. "Get back to full strength first. When the time comes, I know we can count on you, Sergeant. We'll make our final stand together." 3 days later, Forge stood at the viewport of a Pelican, watching Harvester's atmosphere burn below. He and his fellow Marines were utterly silent, faces stony. This battle was over. All that remained was their vengeance. Their dropship dove into the firestorm, pursued by Seraph fighters. Forge braced himself as anti-air rounds pelted the hull. His pilot pulled off a wild series of evasive maneuvers that rattled Forge's teeth. "Brace for impact," the pilot yelled. They crashed hard amidst the rubble of a destroyed UNSC firebase. Forge shook off the daze and rallied his men as they stormed out. A pair of hunters advanced through the smoke, fuel rods already glowing. Forge and his Marines scattered as green fire rained down. They returned fire with grenades and rockets, blasting away chunks of the hunter's armor until finally the behemoths toppled. No time to celebrate their kill. Forge led the team forward towards the sounds of battle, the endless staccato of MA5 rifles mixed with Covenant plasma and shrieks. They crested a hill that offered a vista of a sprawling battlefield. Thousands of human and Covenant troops were engaged in close quarters combat across the smoldering plain. Warthogs and Scorpion tanks dueled wraiths and revenants amidst the churning chaos. Banshees and Hornets swooped overhead, trailing smoke and fire. And looming above it all was the ominous bulk of the Covenant supercarrier Incorruptible. Forge checked his rifle and clips. "No more running. This ground is where we make our stand." His Marines shouted oaths and moved to join the battle. Forge led them down the hillside, almost instantly swallowed up by the surging tides of troops. He crashed into a pack of grunts and gunned them down, then snapped off shots at a carbine-wielding jackal. An elite roared and charged him with energy sword drawn. Forge reflexively whipped out his combat knife and managed to parry the first swipe before driving the blade into its throat. All around him, humans and Covenant slaughtered each other in a frenzy at point-blank range. This was no longer battle, but pure butchery. Forge had never seen such relentless carnage, but still he rallied his men forward. They had reached the last bitter dregs of a losing war, but it wasn't over until the last human drew breath. Chapter 10. Aboard the Incorruptible's bridge, Repa Morami watched the battle with satisfaction. The human soldiers fought like crazed animals, even in the face of inevitable defeat. Such futile courage might be admirable, were it not so foolishly misplaced. Excellency, our forces have breached the final human perimeter around their headquarters complex, reported an officer. We await your word to commence bombardment. Morami studied the tactical scans showing puny human transports desperately ferrying civilians up to their ships in orbit. Pathetic. Their soft hearts only prolonged the inevitable. Focus fire on those civilian ships first, let fear break their spirit, then advance our troops to finish them. The deck rumbled beneath his feet as lances of plasma streaked down and vaporized the helpless human shuttles. How many thousands more would die today? It mattered not. In death, even these humans would further the Covenant's divine great journey. Another officer approached, head bowed. Noble Arbiter, our expeditionary teams report the entrance to the sacred dig site remains blocked by the human-caused avalanche. Repa Morami's eyes narrowed with cold fury. The humans believed they could halt our holy progress by burying their sins, but no barrier lasts forever against the Prophet's will. He opened a channel to the fleet. Send down excavation teams with hunter escorts. Melt through the obstruction by any means. I will have the relics within that tomb. This cursed world had slowed his quest enough. Once his teams pried open that sacred vault, humankind would face judgment for its crimes. The secret gifts of the gods awaited below, and Morami would see them be used to rain divine wrath upon these heretics. Until then, his troops would continue the slaughter unabated. Full bombardment, he commanded. Burn these wretched humans from our sacred ground. Repa Morami crossed his arms behind his back, mandibles twitching in anticipation. Soon his destiny would reveal itself. Chapter 11. Forge took cover behind a jagged metal slab, one of the few remnants of a building destroyed in the bombardment. All around him, the surface of Harvest had become a nightmarish hellscape. Ash fell from the sky like snow as Covenant plasma scoured what little remained above ground. Forge checked his weapon, and ammo yet again. His assault rifle was scratched and scorched, its magazine down to the last few rounds. He was coated head to toe in grime and blood, only some of it his own. After 3 days of endless fighting, all his men were spent. They had nothing left to give. Forge peered across at their exhausted, shell-shocked faces, just a handful of Marines now from his original 100. His radio crackled to life, a Captain Cutter's voice barely audible through static. Sergeant, Covenant forces, closing in on final targets. Spirit of Fire will cover your escape. Forge switched channels to hail the cutter directly. Sorry, Captain, you're breaking up, but I already know what you'll say. Save yourselves while we buy you time down here. He stared around at his ragged unit. That's not happening. My Marines are done running. This is where we take our stand, to the death if that's what it takes. There was a long pause before Cutter replied. I understand, Sergeant. The Spirit will remain here. Fight to the end. Light our way, darkness. Forge smiled grimly. See you on the other side, Sir. Forge out. He switched off his radio and turned to his Marines one last time. No inspirational speeches, boys, no more words needed at all. Let's show these bastards how Crimson Company dies, on our feet and firing. Their voices rang out in wordless shouts of defiance. Gripping his rifle, Forge vaulted over their cover and led the final charge across the smoldering battlefield. The few dozen Marines ran headlong into endless ranks of Covenant, firing on full auto. Plasma flashed past them, cutting down men left and right. But still Forge and his soldiers rushed forward like men possessed. They would sell their lives dearly to protect what little remained of their home. Forge crashed down hard, his armor smoldering. Through blurred vision, he saw Hunter looming over him, fuel rod cannon raised to finish him off. He tried to lift his rifle, but his strength was spent. This was it. Suddenly, the Hunter staggered as high-caliber rounds tore into it from behind. A Scorpion tank rolled forward, turret blazing, while a squad of Marines rushed to Forge's side. You look like hell, Sergeant, one of them grinned, helping him up. Let's get you to cover. They supported Forge away from the front lines to a makeshift triage area. He slumped against a metal barrier, fresh blood trickling from his new wounds. Forge blinked through the haze of pain, incredulous. Why are you fools still fighting? He croaked. It's over, we've lost. A grizzled officer knelt beside him, a Colonel Dolphin, commander of the local Marine forces. It ain't over till it's over, son, Dolphin said, checking Forge's injuries. Every minute we hold out here gives more civilians time to evacuate up top. Don't you quit on me now. Forge simply stared at the relentless Covenant tide surging closer amidst the raging fires. Colonel, nothing down here is getting off this rock alive, he said softly. All we can do now is sell our lives dearly before the end. Dolphin gripped his shoulder firm. Not today, Sergeant. Look up there. The Spirit of Fire is moving into position. Forge peered up through the smoky sky. The vast bulk of Cutter's cruiser eclipsed the sun as it descended lower. Dolphin grinned fiercely. Captain Cutter is going to pull off one hell of a gambit. We just need to hang on a little longer. Forge felt the tiniest flicker of hope rekindle. He pulled himself upright against the barricade and reloaded his battered rifle. His men rallied around him, miracle of miracles still standing, despite it all. Together they helped support each other, facing the Covenant surge. If Cutter saw hope, that was enough for Forge. He raised his weapon with renewed defiance. For our home, Forge shouted hoarsely. His Marines echoed the cry. No matter what came next, they would fight until their last breath together. Chapter 12. Aboard the Spirit of Fire's bridge, Cutter watched Harvester burning below with a heavy heart. This battle was lost, but not the war. His ship could still save some fraction of the innocents below. Navigation, bring us into low orbit directly over the planetary capital, he ordered. Deploy all available combat teams for immediate surface extraction operations. The planetside forces were nearly spent, but they had bought him the time he needed. Cutter had formulated an endgame, a desperate gambit, that would cover the evacuation of every remaining civilian they could hold aboard. even if it meant the Spirit of Fire could never escape back into space. His comms officer looked up in alarm. "Sir, Colonel Dalton is refusing to evacuate his troops. He insists on staying behind to cover our retreat." Cutter frowned. "Brave, but foolish. Inform the colonel he has new orders. Get his wounded aboard first, then withdraw all remaining forces." "Aye, sir," relaying orders now. On the tactical display, Cutter watched a swarm of dropships and transports ferry survivors aboard. But below, the Covenant hordes still pressed forward relentlessly. Their holy crusade would accept nothing less than total extermination of humankind on Harvest. The planet had days, perhaps hours, before the Covenant glassed its remaining cities. Cutter silently vowed to rescue every individual possible before that happened. Even if doing so trapped his own ship here forever. "Navigation, chart an emergency descent course into the upper atmosphere," he commanded. "Bring us low enough to shield the evacuation zone from bombardment." His bridge officers glanced up in surprise at the audacious order, but complied. The deck rumbled as the Spirit of Fire dove into Harvester's smoky skies on a trajectory that would bring them below even the lowest Covenant cruisers. Alarms blared instantly. "Sir, the heat and turbulence are already straining our hull far past redline limits." Cutter's eyes narrowed. "Divert all power to forward shields. We need to buy them just a little more time." He watched out the view screen as Harvester's ravaged surface sped dizzyingly closer. Spirit of Fire shook more violently with each second. Cutter ignored the urgent damage warnings flashing across his console. His ship could not pull up now without dooming the evacuation effort. They had reached the point of no return. Finally, the evacuation transports flickered safely away into slip space. Cutter allowed himself a small sigh of relief despite their own dire circumstance. "Recovery team is away. Now get us out of this gravity well." His helmsman struggled with the controls. "Sir, turbulence is too severe. I cannot stabilize our trajectory for escape velocity." Cutter gripped the command table grimly as the deck plating buckled and screeched under the strain. Ruptures vented atmosphere across the bridge while coils glowed white-hot. Their faithful ship could endure no more. Harvester now held them in its inescapable grip alongside the millions of lost souls this day. Silently, Cutter made his peace. They had fought to the last for those who could not. "Full stop on thrusters," he ordered softly. "Brace for impact." The bridge crew silently complied, exchanging stoic nods of acceptance. Together, they had turned back the darkness one final time. Cutter closed his eyes as the Spirit of Fire blazed brightly across Harvester's skies like a second dawn. The end came in fire instead of ice. Chapter 13. Alarms blared incessantly within the Spirit of Fire's battered hull. Captain Cutter's eyes flickered open to see he was laying on the darkened bridge amidst flickering terminals. He tasted blood and felt a painful ringing in his ears. "Damage report," he croaked, struggling to his feet using a cracked console for support. His first officer pulled herself up from where she had been thrown against the star map projector. "Multiple hull breaches across decks 2 through 11, she reported, wiping blood from her brow. "Main power is offline. Multiple radiation leaks and fires reported." Cutter blinked away the fog in his brain. "What about our reactors?" "Emergency batteries are feeding auxiliary systems, but main cores are down." She met Cutter's gaze. "Sir, by all accounts we should not have survived that crash." Cutter looked around as the rest of his stunned bridge crew picked themselves up and hurried to their stations. View screens showed raging fires and breaches across many decks, but the ship's structure had somehow held together. Barely. "Best guess our location?" he asked. The navigation officer pulled up the offline star charts. "We appear to have crashed deep inside some mountains in one of the polar regions, significantly off course from our planned descent vector." Cutter stroked his chin thoughtfully. "The turbulent winds must have flung us halfway across the damn planet." That unintended relocation had possibly spared them instant immolation within the concentric plasma rings, now glassing Harvester's population centers. Small miracles. "Sensors are still rebooting after the EMP surge," his science officer reported. "But it appears a substantial amount of native fauna survived in these remote mountains." Cutter nodded. "The Covenant will soon finish cleansing the rest of this world, but up here, life yet remains. We must do the same." His crew nodded resolutely. They had beaten impossible odds once already today. Now, to do so again. "Dispatch all damage and medical teams to rescue trapped crew and stabilize our systems," Cutter ordered. "Get emergency bulkheads sealed over those hull breaches and vent fires into space before they spread to vital areas." The bridge bustled into activity again. As his officers coordinated the recovery efforts, Cutter gazed out the view screen at the icy, snow-swept mountain valley they had crashed into. Jagged peaks surrounded them on all sides, hiding his ship from outside view. For now, at least, they had found sanctuary, and with it, new purpose. Chapter 14. 2 weeks after the crash, Cutter walked through the Spirit of Fire's crowded cryobay, examining the rows of occupied pods. He still didn't fully comprehend how they had survived Harvester, much less managed to restore primary systems and energy cores to minimal function. But through sacrifice and ingenuity, his crew had pulled off the impossible. And then some. Not only had they stabilized the ship's own damage, his teams had enacted emergency protocols to evacuate and take aboard over 80,000 refugees rescued from Harvester's surface in the final hours. Nearly double the ship's intended occupancy. Every corridor and bay was crowded with frightened civilians and makeshift shelters. Cutter's Marines and MPs were working tirelessly to maintain order and ration overwhelmed life support systems. The Spirit of Fire had become an overpacked ark, her weary crew devoted to protecting these last survivors. "Cryostasis bays nearly at full capacity, sir," reported Lieutenant Mason, who was overseeing the refugee integration. "We should be ready to begin cryo-release rotation cycles within the day." Cutter nodded. "Let's get it done quickly and quietly. If the Covenant pick up an energy spike, they may investigate." He studied the latest sensor data with unease. Covenant forces had withdrawn from orbit days ago after glazing over Harvester's cities, but Prowler drones still lurked nearby, no doubt looking for survivors. Their ship's crash site deep within the mountains had concealed them so far, but for how long? "How long can we keep 80,000 people alive if Covenant ground forces discover us here?" Cutter asked grimly. Mason shook her head. "No more than a few days at most, sir. We just lack the defensive infrastructure or combat teams, and if they bring in heavy weapons..." She trailed off. They both knew the Spirit of Fire could never fly or fight again. This haven would become a tomb. Cutter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let's just take this one day at a time. As long we remember our duty, there is always hope. Days passed uneasily. Cutter received the first reports of alien drones, scouting the mountains with increasing frequency. Covenant's seek and destroy protocols were extremely methodical. It was only a matter of time now. When at last the word came of an entire Covenant battalion advancing on their position, Cutter made the only possible decision. "Lieutenant, begin emergency cryo-release procedures immediately," he ordered Mason. "Get our people loaded into the Pelican transports for evacuation. Launch teams will plot randomized trajectories to cover our escape." She hurried to carry out his commands. Around Cutter, the ship's corridors echoed with the shouts of Marines guiding terrified civilians carrying children and meager belongings toward waiting dropships. He watched helpless families huddle together in fear before disappearing into cryopods, not knowing what fate awaited them out there. But anything was better than the certain death of capture. The Spirit of Fire had sheltered them as long as it could. Now each crew could only pray their launch trajectory avoided Covenant notice. Sergeant Forge appeared on Cutter's deck, face etched with solemn lines. "The last transports are prepped and ready for your order to launch, sir." Cutter met the man's gaze. "Give the evac order, Sergeant. Get our people away safely." He turned toward the bridge. "And alert the crew, abandoned ship procedures are now in effect." This was the only way to keep their refugees' launch trail ambiguous. His crew would scuttle the Spirit of Fire and flee into the mountains to become ghosts themselves. It was their final gift to the innocents they had sworn to protect. Forge gripped Cutter's shoulder. "It's been an honor, Captain." Cutter watched the last transports flare into the gloomy sky. "For us all, Sergeant, light the way." He took one final look at his broken ship's corridors. So much history here. So much courage within these old wounds. But her crew would live on. Time to fade unto darkness, and trust tomorrow would dawn. Epilogue. A month later, Repa Morami again walked the glassed surface of harvest alongside the holy prophet of regret. The floating throne's gravlifts sank core samples, indicated traces of something deep below. "This world remains stubbornly tainted by human stench," Regret declared. "Their crimes cannot go unpunished." Repa Morami bowed his head. "I will redouble the efforts of my seekers, Holy One. We may yet recover the relics from their vandalized tombs." But despite his vows, doubt gnawed inside the Arbiter. The humans had slipped between his claws time and again during the battle for harvest, even delivering stinging blows in defiance of their inevitable defeat. Their hatred and cunning knew no bounds. Perhaps he had indeed underestimated them, as the prophet of regret now insisted. Repa Morami would not make that mistake again. When next they met in battle, humanity would face the full fury of his wrath. The Arbiter would see every last trace of their presence cleansed. Nothing would stop the Covenant's holy journey again. The end.